Friends, allies, and Americans, welcome to the Defense of Democracy podcast, where we tell the stories of folks who defend your children's rights by advocating for inclusive public school systems and who fight for diversity across our nation. I'm your host, Karen Swoboda. Let's get into it. The guest on the Defense of Democracy podcast today is Jesse Hagopian. Jesse is I want to say you're a member of the Zinn Education Project, but what is your title over there?
Yeah, I'm the director of the Teaching for Black Lives campaign, and I'm on the leadership team. Perfect.
And you've also just written a book. And we've been connected for a while now. And it is just such a pleasure to have you back on the show talking about some of the good work you're doing. So tell me what's been going on. Yeah.
I mean, the struggle continues, unfortunately, Trump was reelected. And so we know that we have our work cut out for us. He has declared open warfare on the truth. If you'll remember the term.
I like that. Yeah.
The term post-truth was added to the Oxford Dictionary during Trump's first term because of how many lies he told. And I'm just hoping that the term post-truth schooling doesn't become the new term added to the dictionary, and instead the term resistance is named the word of the year, because we need students and educators and parents and caregivers and community members to link arms and say the truth is worth fighting for. And the truth is, this country has not always been perfect. Far from it. We have to be honest enough to acknowledge that my ancestors were enslaved, right? And that slavery and genocide of Native people occurred. And there are now almost a majority of students in this country. Nearly half of all students in this country go to a school where there's a law passed that requires their teacher to lie to them about the founding of this country and to dismiss the reality of structural racism. And that's just something that we have to reject and organize to fight for honest education.
Jesse, I know you have done a lot of research. I mean, you're one of the most learned people who I have in my inner circle, which I appreciate. Talk to me about that law that you're discussing. Of the laws that you have gone into and you looked at, that one specifically, but maybe there are others too that are just like, I wasn't aware of that. So can you go into that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, there are many laws across the country regulating now what students can learn about race, about gender, and about sexuality. I call these truth crime laws in my new book, Teach Truth, because they're criminalizing the truth. And they come under several categories. One of the categories is laws banning discomfort. So anything that you teach that causes discomfort in the classroom is now illegal. Well, guess what? Slavery and genocide should produce discomfort in the classroom.
That's a normal human reaction to a crime against humanity, right? These crimes exist.
That's exactly right. And, social justice educators, or truth teachers, as I call them in the book, they want to teach the honest history of this country. It has nothing to do with shaming white children, right? We actually want to build up white children and let them know that there is an incredible tradition of anti-racist white people, from the Grimke sisters who organized against slavery and John Brown to Howard Zinn and Ann Braden in the civil rights movement, and many more. And that we want to let them know they have a choice, that they don't have to just sit in the discomfort of crimes that our country has committed, that they can be part of a mighty solidarity that can bring joy and justice.
And, I look at, Germany, and a lot of times, and I've been doing this for like the past 2 years very vocally, that we should look at Germany in 1930, 1927, and see what was going on and how that reflects into what's going on in our country right now.
Mm.
And you look at the country of Germany and how it handled, like, they're required their students to know what happened during they require them to visit the uh, concentration camps. Um, there is a huge error in judgment to, I mean, it's beyond an error in judgment, but you know what I'm saying? Like, to pretend that never happened,
Yes.
or this slavery never happened, you know?
I'm so glad you raised that history in Germany, and that students there are taught about the Holocaust, and there are public monuments and memorials
Mhm.
to the crimes of the Nazi Party all over the country. And that's just not the case here. In the United States, we hide the past, and that's so
Well,
dangerous.
it's even worse. In the United States, you have Confederate, quote, heroes, monuments to them put up all over, and you will not go to Germany and see Adolf Hitler statues.
That's
Like,
exactly right. And it
right?
was driven home for me when my dad recently discovered which plantation our family had been enslaved on.
Oh, wow.
And we took a pilgrimage there, my dad, my brother, and I, and a friend of my dad's. And we got down to Mississippi, to a very small, unincorporated town called Morgantown, Mississippi, where the Lenoir plantation existed. And we were able to go onto the land and do a ceremony for our ancestors. But nowhere is there a marker that says, right here, hundreds of Black people were subjected to one of the worst crimes against humanity: the forced labor and breeding
Mhm.
of Black women, the beating and torture they endured. There's no marker, there's no public remembrance there. And we were fortunate enough to meet a man who owned the land, who, on his own volition, had kept the gravesite uh, clean and maintained, where our ancestors had buried each other.
Oh my
And
God.
he was able to show us there was one gravestone left that still stood. So we were able to hold our ceremony where I read a letter to my ancestors that was my promise to them of how I would keep their memory alive. And that's how I start my new book off, with the letter that I read to my ancestors, because I want people to know that this work is deeply personal. This was only my great great grandmother who was
Mhm.
enslaved, and grandfather who were enslaved on that plantation. And when we went back down there this past spring, we met a woman in her 90s who was friends with my formerly enslaved great great grandmother. She so when people say this is ancient history, it it doesn't have any bearing on today, and we should
Right.
just forget it. There are people alive today who are friends with enslaved people. It wasn't that long ago, and it's a history that directly impacts the inequality and systemic racism we see today.
What a story about going back. I mean, what was, okay, first of all, your letter, which you answered one of the questions I was going to ask, is you've published it. Would you be comfortable if I shared that in our podcast notes, so that people could actually read that? Um,
Absolutely,
okay.
absolutely, and people should um, they can order a signed copy of my new book from Elliott
Okay.
Books and read the entire letter there, and uh and the whole context and the story behind us going.
Well, and that's another thing. Like, why don't I'll put the link to order your book in the podcast notes. How about that? Like, that'll give them, I mean, so let's talk about the book, right? You tell me what you called the book, and what went into researching and what it's about.
So the book is called Teach Truth: The Struggle for Anti-Racist Education. And I've never worked harder on a project. I'm so excited for the release date on January 14th. I interviewed educators and students and parents and caregivers all across the country who are part of the Teach Truth movement to oppose these laws that ban honest history about US's systemic racism, and also honest history about homophobia and transphobia.
Mhm.
And I did a whole lot of research, and really saw a continuity between the first anti-literacy laws that were passed in the United States.
Okay.
The first anti-literacy law was in 1740 in South Carolina, and it was a direct response to the uprising of Black enslaved people in the Stono Rebellion, led by a man named Jemmy. And he marched with a banner that said liberty. And he went plantation to plantation collecting other enslaved people who wanted to fight for their freedom. And when that rebellion was put down, they didn't just kill all the rebels. They wanted to kill the very ability of Black people to ever write that word liberty again.
Wow.
And so that was the first anti-literacy law, but it spread throughout the South because they knew that education could aid in liberation for Black people. And, from there, after the Civil War, Black people built the public schools in the United States, right?
Yes. Go into that because that's important for people to know.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I'll say a word on that. I mean, there were public schools in the North before the Civil War, but they often excluded Black people, right? So how public are we really talking here? And in the South, there were no public schools. So it was really the uprising of newly freed Black folks, knowing that there was no liberation without education. And they built the public schools. They got support from the Freedmen's Bureau, and they did everything they could. They built hundreds of schools all over. And this was a threat to white supremacy. And it was possibly the number one target of the Ku Klux Klan was schools that served Black children. And they burnt these schools down by the hundreds. Over 600 Black schools were burnt down.
Wow.
And it's important to note that there were even integrated schools in the 1860s, like in New Orleans, and that white children dramatically benefited from a public school system being formed in the South. But this is really the legacy that today's anti-history, anti-CRT crusaders stand in. They stand in the tradition of denying education to Black children, and we stand in a tradition of fighting for liberatory schooling.
So tell me, I mean, when you're talking about the 1700s, the 1800s, and the attack on the public school system then, and the reason it was there was to hobble people from being able to mobilize and communicate and connect and think critically and all of those things. Compare it to what's going on now.
Yeah.
Because there's a very serious attack on the American public school systems today.
Absolutely. I mean, it is staggering what's happening in classrooms across the country. There was a recent report that showed that 2/3 of educators now are censoring themselves on issues of race and gender and sexuality, on Black history, on American history. They're simply not teaching the things that they know and care about out of fear that a school official will fire or a parent
child.
will attack them, right? And these fears are not unfounded. I mean, Washington Post did a study within the first year of these laws being passed in 2021 that showed 160 educators had either been fired or pushed out of their classroom for discussions around race or gender. And since then, we know many, many others. But I have a friend who taught in Wisconsin, Melissa Temple. She was a beloved first grade teacher, teaching bilingual classes, a veteran teacher of probably a couple decades. And her students were getting ready to participate in a school musical, and they wanted to sing a song called Rainbow Land not a radical anthem. We're talking about a pop song by Miley Cyrus and Dolly Parton.
Oh my God.
It
Okay.
it didn't even mention LGBTQ plus people. It just said we want to live in a world where everyone is treated well.
Wow. Wow.
Okay?
That's crazy. Like,
And the students were told they
oh my God.
cannot sing that song at the school musical, that it's too controversial. Well, my friend Melissa sent a tweet out on a Friday saying, my students should be able to sing this song. It was on her own time, on her
Mhm.
private account. Okay. She said, I think they should be able to sing this song. On Monday, she showed up for work. She comes in, and there's a police officer in the
Oh,
office with a district HR representative who escort her out of the building, and she was fired, never allowed to return to the classroom. This is the kind of McCarthyism,
yeah.
kind of neo Red Scare and Lavender Scare that's going on today. And that's why in the book I go through the history of the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare.
Good. And that brings, okay, so what you're talking about is something called the chilling effect, which is
Yeah.
actually a legal term, right? It's a real term called the chilling effect, and that is when you put enough out there that people will self-censor, right? And I'll give it my own example is my son was in a high school class, and one of the students, they were a history class, and they said something about the Holocaust. One of the students raised their hands and said, I don't believe in the Holocaust. Okay. And the teacher, my son came out and told me this story, and I've never forgotten where I was on Route 9 in my car. Walmart was on my left. Like, it was so crystal embedded in my psyche at this point, where he said, that the teacher turned to him and said, I don't want to get into that right now.
Mm.
And that teacher let that whole classroom full of kids leave with a doubt as to whether the Holocaust existed. And that's what we're talking about.
That's
She
terrible.
censored herself, just like the teachers are doing now in response. Now, can how is that? I mean, this is kind of diverging from the topic, but how is that not a lawsuit waiting to happen?
Yeah, well, thankfully, I also cover in the book the legal actions that are being taken, and
Good.
thankfully there are important legal challenges being made by groups like the ACLU
Yeah.
against these truth crime laws. Uh,
Wow.
and, they have a lot of legal precedent that should have these laws overturned. Unfortunately, we know that the current Supreme Court is handpicked by Donald Trump. And so
Yeah.
we'll have to see if they want to follow the law or just follow what I call uncritical race theory
Mhm.
of Donald Trump and the like.
Now, Jesse, about halfway through the show, we're slightly more than halfway through, but I always do a volunteer shout out. So I'm going to do a quick shout out to one of my favorite people. Her name is Cheryl. She is from Illinois. She's a member of our board of directors. She helps with everything from, the grants applications. She has been a real, supporter of the organization as far as our connecting with communities of color, and really just been such an incredible asset. So, Cheryl, I want to say thank you to all the time that you give to Defense of Democracy. And now,
Yeah,
Jesse, we'll go back to you.
say thank you to her as well. I mean, it's all about the grassroots organizers. That's the only chance we stand, right? And so much of my book is dedicated to them. So I'm right there.
How do you're like me, you're involved in this kind of advocacy movement during probably one of certainly the darkest time in my country's history that I've experienced. Um, People are having a lot of trouble. Like, there are some organizations that are just kind of buckling under the weight of the work we have to do.
Yeah.
Um, have you seen that? Or I've seen that. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough times. There's no sugarcoating it. I mean, when half the students in the US already go to a school where it's required that they be lied to, and
Yeah.
this is before Trump takes office for his second term, we have to have a sobering analysis and look reality in the face. This is going to be a very challenging time. And yet, I find a lot of hope. And
Yeah. I was gonna ask you that, like, what you're still going, and if anything, I feel like I've always felt this from you, but, like, just strong, a little there's joy there, there's hope, I guess is the word I'm looking for. What keeps you going?
I mean, a few things like I got to interview some incredible people for this book who will never give up the struggle. And when you've talked to these folks, you
Mhm.
know that we're not going down easy, and it is going to be an epic struggle. And
Yeah.
there's going to be a great uprising for truth again. When you talk to the young folks that I talk to, you
Mhm.
know that. There are young people in this book who have organized their peers at the high school level to surround Capitol buildings and
Mhm.
get anti-trans laws overturned, right? And
Yes.
uh, I think the other great source of hope for me, it really is knowing our history. And that's precisely why they are banning history, why they're banning honest accounts of history,
Mhm.
because they know it's a guide to getting free. It's a guide to achieving true multiracial democracy, right? The
Right.
McCarthy era uh, sent thousands of teachers onto blacklists. They were fired all across the country. In New York City alone, over 400 teachers were fired under suspicion of being communists, and thousands of LGBTQ plus government officials and teachers were fired across the country in the lavender scare of that era. But what was it that ended the McCarthy era? How did that horrible witch hunt come to an end? It was the civil rights movement. It was
Mhm.
the massive uprising of Black people who
Mhm.
said, we're done with Jim Crow segregation. How dare you declare to be the land of the free and the home of the brave while you practice apartheid all across this country? And they lost their fear, filled up the jails, demonstrating, and uh, that was the force that was able to bring the hysteria and paranoia of McCarthyism to an end. And I know once again, this neo McCarthy era that
Mhm.
Trump is leading will be brought to an end by a great uprising. We saw the uprising in 2020, and it was a mass multiracial uprising, right? It was oriented around the struggle for Black lives, but we saw millions of white people take the streets in that struggle. And that's really what scared the uncritical race theorists. They saw millions of multiracial people all over the
Yeah.
country. And they knew their time was going to be limited, that people were learning the truth about history and applying it today. And so instead of having an open debate about that history and dialogue, they just moved to pass laws to ban it.
Um, One of the things that I take a lot of inspiration from is the civil rights movement. Um, if only because, one of the things that I tell my volunteers all the time is like nobody's going to come and save you,
That's
right? You got to do the work. And all of those people of color during the civil rights movement, not only did no one come in, they were actively breaking the law
mm,
by standing up for those rights. So we find ourselves in a similar situation, and I'll look back and I'll say, you know what? Honestly, they had greater odds and they were able to achieve success.
yeah,
And so it's a matter of us kind of keeping our eye on the prize and saying this is not a new thing to this country. Like, this is what we're about and we can do it.
that's it. I mean, they too often the civil rights movement gets taught as one or two icons that overturned
Yes.
Jim Crow and
It
changed.
was Martin Luther King and it was, JFK, and there was like, yeah.
But in fact, it was millions of ordinary people that did it. It was
Mhm.
groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We're talking about teenagers who
Right.
were the most decisive players in the civil rights movement. And when you learn that history, you know that as a parent, as a student, as a teacher, you are the key to the struggle today. And
Absolutely.
I mean, getting to interview teachers who refuse to abide by laws that tell them to lie to kids is so inspiring. I've talked to dozens of teachers around the country in states like Florida and Texas
Hmm.
who are practicing what Jarvis Givens calls fugitive pedagogy. They're teaching the truth regardless of the law, and it's incredibly inspiring.
Absolutely. So let's talk about. I always like to kind of wrap up the podcast on a positive and high note. Usually I let my guest choose, but this time I'm going to ask you to talk about a wonderful event that Defense of Democracy participated in last year that you were holding in June called Teach the Truth.
Yeah,
What can we talk about that as our positive high note at the end of the show?
absolutely.
Okay.
I'm so excited about our National Day of Action. It's going to be on June 7th. So we
Mhm.
have months to prepare and to plan for it. And it is in a series of days of action. We've done this every year for the last several years,
Mhm.
and it is growing in strength and numbers and visibility. And this year could be the most powerful yet. We believe that
If Defense of Democracy has anything to do with it, yes. Like we had a taste of it last year.
right,
It was so well run, so exciting. Actually, one of the books from your event is sitting behind me. I put
I
it on
know,
display. So yes,
excellent.
very excited. Go ahead.
I'm so glad you all participated last year and had such a
Hmm.
good experience. It's so easy to participate,
That was the best part. It was so easy.
right? I mean, if you go to the Zen Education Project website, zeneducationproject.org, uh, you can go to our Teach Truth campaign and you can sign up to be sent a box that will come with examples of banned books and descriptions of the inane reasons why they are trying to ban these books. And you can get all sorts of materials to pass out to people in your neighborhood about the struggle to teach truth. And we make it as easy as possible. Some groups get more organized and coordinated, and they lead historical walking tours to teach the history that is being banned in the schools right there in their own community. So there was an example in Michigan of a group that went to the actual railroad tracks where Malcolm X's dad was held down and lynched, and
Oh my.
then marched to the hospital where he ended up dying. And they
Mhm.
passed out banned books to the kids in the hospital. Um,
Oh,
there was a walking tour in Memphis where they went around to where the slave auction sites were, including one on the ground where their very school stood, right? And this is the history that's being denied students when they pass these discomfort laws or these laws
mhm.
uh, banning discussion about systemic racism. Or in Florida, the official state curriculum says that slavery was of, quote, personal benefit.
Wow. Like so.
That's how
I
far
think I knew that, but I just
that's how
okay.
far it's gotten, right? And that's why this year's Day of Action is going to be the largest ever. We are partnering with groups like Defense of Democracy, like Heal Together,
Mhm.
uh, like the teachers unions, and many communities are going to organize events, and we hope that your listeners will too.
And I will say that I'm taking notes so that the link to get involved in the June 7th uh Teach the Truth event is are going to be in our podcast notes as well. So I highly encourage, and our teams will all be participating.
I should just add that this year we're also adding a component where you can do rolling actions in the lead up to June
Oh,
7th.
fun.
too. So if there's a better date for your community, like
Mhm.
before your schools get out or some some important anniversary you want to highlight, you can also be added to our map of actions, and it can culminate in something on June 7th.
Perfect. Well, Jesse, thank you so much for joining the Defense of Democracy podcast. I certainly look forward to creating more good trouble with you in the months and years to come.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.